April 9th, 1241. Liegnitz, Poland. Henry the Pious, Duke of Silesia, watches the enemy retreat. 20,000 knights and soldiers of Christendom, the flower of Polish and German knighthood, stand on the battlefield and see the Mongol cavalry turn and flee. Horses thunder away. Dust rises. The enemy retreats in utter disarray, and Henry makes the fatal decision for him. He orders the attack. His knights break formation. Heavy war horses charge forward. Armor clangs, banners fly. The cry of 10,000 men, confident of imminent victory, rings out. They pursue the fleeing Mongols across open ground, faster and faster, stretching out across the plain, losing their tight formations with every stride. Then, smoke appears, black, thick, enveloping the flanks. No one knows what it is. Some historians claim the Mongols used some form of smoke weapon, possibly naphtha, to blind and disorient the pursuers. And then, from within this smoke, horns sound. The Mongols cease their flight. They turn. In one coordinated movement, the entire retreating army turns, and hidden flanking cavalry bursts in from both sides into the center. Henry's army, stretched out for half a mile across open ground, is no longer in formation. Horses begin to tire, running straight into a closing trap. The battle lasts less than an hour. Henry II, Duke of Silesia, dies on this field. His head is paraded on a spear before the walls of Liegnitz. It is reported that the Mongols cut off the right ear of every Christian soldier killed that day and sent 9 full sacks to their commander. 9 sacks. And this is what should truly strike you. This was not even the main Mongol army. These were flank forces. The main invasion was happening simultaneously in Hungary, 200 miles away, where a completely different Mongol army, in the same week, executed an almost identical trap against King Bela IV at the Battle of Mohi. This was coordinated between 2 countries before the telegraph, before radio, before anything we would recognize as modern communication. This is what we are really talking about when we talk about Mongol cavalry, not just horsemen, not just speed and brutality. We are talking about a military system so far ahead of its time that the peoples it destroyed literally couldn't understand what was happening to them. So the question is not whether the Mongols were dangerous. Everyone knows that. The real question, the one that keeps historians awake at night, is how they built it. How to transform a nomadic people from the steppe, without cities, without formal armies, without an industrial base, into the most effective cavalry force in human history. The answer begins much earlier than any battle. It begins with something so elementary that most people overlook it entirely. It begins with the horse, a creature that nobody respected. Let me tell you about the Mongol horse. Because almost everything else about the Mongol war machine depends on understanding this animal first and foremost. When European chroniclers first encountered Mongol war horses, they were baffled. Matthew Paris, an English monk writing in the 1240s, described them as small, stocky creatures, almost ponies. He could barely reconcile these humble-looking animals with the apocalyptic army they carried. The horses looked wrong. They seemed inadequate. They seemed an unsuitable tool for the job. This was the first and last mistake anyone made about them. The Mongol horse is not fast compared to an Arabian courser or a European destrier. On a straight run, it will lose. But that comparison is entirely irrelevant, because wars are not fought on straight tracks. In ideal conditions, wars are fought across steppes, mountains, frozen rivers, and deserts, for months on end, without supply depots at the end. And for the kind of war the Mongols actually fought, the Mongol horse was not merely adequate, it was optimal. These horses could cover 95 to 120 kilometers in a single day. Not as a feat, but consistently, day in and day out. They did not require a grain ration. In winter, they would dig through the snow with their hooves to find the grass beneath. They survived temperatures that would have killed other breeds. They were, in all meaningful military senses, self-sufficient. Now understand what that means strategically. Every major army in the medieval world was limited by its supply train, feeding the horses, feeding the men, maintaining the movement of the wagons. This was an exhausting logistical reality that slowed every campaign. It made winter warfare almost impossible, and it forced armies to follow roads and rivers, because that's where the food was. The Mongols had no such problem. Their horses freed them from the leash that every other army in the world wore without even knowing it. They could move anywhere, anytime, in conditions no one else could operate in. This is not a tactical advantage. It is a strategic revolution. Every Mongol warrior typically took 3 to 5 horses on campaign, sometimes more. He would ride one, rest the others, and constantly rotate them. Giovanni da Pian del Carpin, a Franciscan monk who visited the Mongol court in the 1240s, noted that a warrior would not mount the same horse again until it had rested for 3 or 4 days. This is how the entire army moved. It was a deployed relay system of living flesh that never tired. This kind of speed proved a profound shock to contemporaries. Mongol troops could strike one target, disappear, and then suddenly appear somewhere else entirely. They covered distances so rapidly that enemy commanders who received word of one Mongol column would turn to find another Mongol column already at their backs. But there is another aspect of this relationship that most people overlook. The Mongol horse was not merely a mode of transportation. It was a complete field support system for the army that rode it. On long campaigns, when food was scarce, warriors could nick a small vein in the horse's neck, draw a controlled amount of blood, perhaps a liter, drink it for sustenance, and then close the wound. The horse survived, the warrior survived, the campaign continued. This practice, documented by many contemporaries, including Marco Polo, meant that the Mongol army carried its own food supply in a way no other army could. The horses also provided milk, which could be fermented into kumis, an alcoholic beverage that formed the basis of the Mongol diet. Their hides provided leather for armor, footwear, and equipment. Their tendons served as raw material for bowstrings. In times of extreme need, they could be a source of meat. The Mongol horse was not a weapons platform. It was an entire logistical base for an army that required no other logistical base. And the relationship between horse and rider was so personal that it directly impacted combat effectiveness. Contemporary accounts attest that a well-trained Mongol horse would respond to its rider's whistle and follow him like a dog. The horse responded not just to the tension of the reins, but to the relationship built over years of daily interaction. In combat, this meant the rider's hands were truly free, because the horse was a willing partner in movement, rather than a small animal being forcefully controlled. But horses alone do not explain everything, because horse and rider were a single entity, and the rider had been prepared for this his entire life. Mongol children began riding at 3 or 4 years of age, not learning to ride, but riding. By the age of 10, a Mongol boy would have spent more hours in the saddle than most medieval European knights did in their entire careers. By the time he was old enough to fight in battle, the horse was not a vehicle he controlled. It was an extension of his body. This mattered for one specific reason. It freed his hands. A European knight on horseback had to think about staying in the saddle. His attention was divided. His hands were partially occupied with control. But a Mongol warrior, who had ridden since time immemorial, thought about his horse no more than you think about walking. It was at the level of automaticity, which meant both hands were free for the bow, and the bow changed everything. The Mongols treated hunting and warfare as the same activity. The great driven hunts, called the Nuru, were not entertainment. They were organized military exercises, sometimes involving thousands of riders, surrounding a vast tract of steppe and gradually closing the circle to drive the animals inward. The coordination required, the patience required, the ability to maintain disciplined formations over many miles of open ground. These were precisely the skills required for standard Mongol battlefield tactics of encirclement. They were literally practicing warfare during hunts, doing so every year of their lives. Therefore, when people speak of Mongol cavalry as some innovation invented by Genghis Khan, they miss the point. Genghis Khan did not invent it. He organized something that had been developing for generations. A culture that had accidentally developed the perfect military training program without ever calling it that. The steppe itself was the academy, and the degree it conferred was written in the language of the composite bow. Here is a number I want you to remember. 400 meters is the distance at which a Mongol archer could send a ballistic shot. That is, not aiming at a specific individual, but releasing an arrow on a trajectory to rain down on a formation of 400 meters. That is approximately 4 American football fields. And accurate, aimed fire was possible at 150 to 175 meters. For comparison, the English longbow, which the English considered so perfect that they legally required every man to practice with it on Sundays, had a maximum effective range of about 200 meters, and shooting a longbow from horseback was physically impossible, simply due to the draw length of the bow. It required standing and applying full-body force, which was unfeasible for a moving horse. The Mongol composite bow was a completely different technological solution. It was shorter, compact enough to be drawn and shot from a moving horse in any direction, and yet its power was comparable to, or even exceeded that of, other bow types. The secret lay in its construction. This was not a weapon carved from a single piece of wood, but a meticulously engineered object made of different materials. Wood was used for the core, animal horn for the inner limb facing the target, and animal sinew for the outer limb. These three materials worked in opposition to each other, storing and releasing energy with astonishing efficiency. It could take an experienced craftsman years to properly construct a single composite bow. The glues had to cure, the materials to set under tension. Rushing the process led to defective bows. The Mongols meticulously cared for these weapons, keeping them in cases to protect them from moisture and temperature fluctuations that could deform the materials and compromise the tension. This was an instrument of the highest precision, used, incidentally, for destruction. Here is the detail of its construction that strikes me the most. The horn on the inner limb, facing the target, naturally resists compression. When you draw the bow, this part is compressed. Horn has exceptional resistance to such compression, storing energy rather than deforming. Sinew on the outer limb, facing the archer, naturally resists tension. When drawn, this part stretches, and the sinew can store this stretched energy, much like a spring. Combine these two materials with a wooden core that serves as a structural frame, and you have a bow storing energy through two completely different physical processes simultaneously. Upon release, both of these processes are unleashed at the same time. This is why a short composite bow can match or exceed the power of a much longer wooden bow. It is not about size. It is about the physical properties of the materials. The Mongols did not understand physics in scientific terms, but they mastered engineering through centuries of practical development. Now let's add what the archer could do with it. Mongol archers carried 2 or 3 bows, a heavier one for shooting from the ground, and a lighter one, optimal for horseback. They carried multiple quivers, each capable of holding 60 arrows. In the field, they used small files to sharpen arrowheads, and arrowheads were not universal. They were specialized for specific tasks. There were armor-piercing heads, hardened by heating iron red-hot, and plunging it into brine to increase carbon content and create a harder cutting edge. There were broadhead tips designed to inflict wounds that were difficult to heal. There were whistling arrows with hollow heads and holes, which made a piercing sound in flight, specifically used to terrify enemy horses and men before battle. There were incendiary arrows, whose tips were wrapped in naphtha-soaked material and lit before being fired. And there were signal arrows, used to coordinate movements on the battlefield. The Mongol equivalent of radio. A Mongol warrior going into battle carried not a single weapon, but an entire weapon system. The rate of fire for a trained archer on horseback was approximately 6 arrows per minute. Now calculate for a tumen, a unit of 10,000 Mongol warriors. Even if only half of them were actively shooting at any given moment, that is 30,000 arrows per minute, constantly flying from formation, with ranges up to 150 meters for accurate fire and up to 400 meters for suppression. Nothing in the medieval world could withstand this. There was no defense against it. It did not require entering this range, which meant crossing hundreds of meters of open ground while arrows continued to fly, and the arrows themselves were designed for both horses and men. The Mongols had special arrowhead designs for killing horses, because a dismounted knight in full plate armor is just a very expensive infantryman who can barely walk. But the most terrifying technique was not the volume. It was what Mongol archers could do during a retreat. The Parthian shot, named after ancient Iranian warriors who used a similar technique for centuries prior, the ability to turn in the saddle while retreating from an enemy and shoot backward with full accuracy. The Mongols had mastered this at a collective level. Their famous feigned retreat was not merely a tactical deception, it was also an active destruction operation. As the enemy pursued what appeared to be fleeing cavalry, the Mongols were shooting backward into the pursuing formation the entire time. They were killing you while running away from you. There is one specific biomechanical detail here that I find striking. Some researchers have concluded that the optimal moment to release an arrow from horseback occurs in that brief instant when all 4 of the horse's hooves are simultaneously off the ground, which happens at the peak of each leaping motion. In that fraction of a second, the rider's platform is absolutely stable. An experienced Mongol archer would instinctively catch this moment and release an arrow, because he had been on a horse for so long that the animal's movements had become as natural to him as his own breathing, and the arrows themselves were the result of careful development. Arrowheads were sharpened in the field and attached to shafts, whose fletching provided stability in flight. Before every major engagement, the army's arrows underwent inspection and preparation. This was not a secondary concern. Logistics were treated with the same seriousness as any other military supply. The bow, the horse, the archer, 3 elements, impressive in themselves. Together, they created something that had no equal in the 13th century. But there is a reason I have not yet spoken about individual Mongol warriors, because individual skill, even at this high level, does not explain the Battle of Liegnitz. It does not explain the Battle of Mohi, and it does not explain the coordinated invasion of 2 countries I described at the beginning of this video. That requires something more complex than the composite bow. It requires organization, and Genghis Khan's genius for organization, I would argue, was even more revolutionary than anything his cavalry with weapons was capable of. If you find this explanation useful, if you want to see more deep dives like this into military history, hit that subscribe button right now. We go this deep on every video. Now, let's talk about the system that brought it all together. In 1206, when Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes and declared himself Great Khan, he did something that almost no conqueror in history before him had done on such a scale. He disbanded the old army and built a new one from scratch. The old Mongol military system was built on tribal allegiances. You fought for your chief. Your chief fought for his confederation. Everyone understood who was friend and who was foe. Along these tribal lines, this system had existed for centuries on the steppe, and it had one catastrophic flaw. At the moment tribal loyalties shifted, the army fell apart. Genghis Khan had experienced this himself. Betrayal, desertion, allies becoming enemies overnight. He understood better than anyone that an army built on personal and tribal ties was an army with structural weaknesses built into its very foundation. So he eliminated that foundation. He took warriors from different tribes and dispersed them into units according to his organizational scheme, not their origin. A man from the Karyid tribe might find himself in an arban, the basic unit of 10, with men from the Naiman, the Merkit, the Tatar people who had recently been killing each other. Now they ate together, trained together, fought together, and depended on each other for survival. This was deliberate and ruthless social engineering, and it worked exactly as Genghis Khan intended. The loyalty of these men shifted over time from their tribe to their unit, and from their unit to the Khan. The old fault lines vanished. The organizational structure he imposed on this new army was a decimal system. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men. An arban of 10 men was the basic fighting unit. 10 arbans formed a Zun of 100 men. 10 Zuns formed a Myangan of 1,000 men, and 10 Myangans formed a Tumen of 10,000 men, the basic operational unit of the Mongol army. This is what makes it a truly brilliant military structure, not merely an administrative convenience. Each level of this hierarchy was capable of independent action. A Tumen could divide into Myangans that dispersed and reformed. A Myangan could split into Zuns operating on separate lines of advance, all the way down to the arban. A group of 10 men could conduct reconnaissance, an ambush, a raid on their own initiative, without waiting for orders from above. Compare this to the armies the Mongols fought against. A European feudal army in the 13th century was essentially a collection of personal retinues, gathered around a lord. There were a few thousand actual knights and squires, trained professional soldiers, and then tens of thousands of levied infantry, farmers, artisans, men called up by feudal obligation, who might have had 1 to 2 days of rudimentary training. Against them stood a fully professional force, where every soldier had been in rigorous training his entire life, and where even the smallest unit could think and act tactically. It was an unequal battle. It could never be a fair fight. Leadership in the Mongol system was also revolutionary for its time. Promotion was strictly on merit. Genghis Khan could promote a man from a conquered tribe, or even a former enemy, to high command if he demonstrated ability. His chief general, Subutai, came from a humble background and rose to possibly the greatest operational commander of the medieval era, campaigning on 3 continents and winning over 60 battles. This was due not to his lineage, but to his outstanding professional qualities. This meritocratic system extended through all levels of the army hierarchy, creating something extraordinary. A culture of command was forged where officers of all levels were expected to show initiative, adapt to changing circumstances, and make decisions without constant oversight from above. This is a key principle of modern military doctrine today, known as mission command or Auftragstaktik in German. The Mongols were applying it in the 11th century. Before any invasion, there was months or years of preparatory intelligence gathering. Mongol spies, often posing as merchants, infiltrated enemy territories, identifying water sources, road conditions, weaknesses in defenses, political divisions, and sources of local discontent that could be exploited. The Mongols often knew more about an enemy country than its own commanders. The communication system during campaigns was unparalleled in the medieval world. The yam, an imperial system of post stations and mounted couriers, allowed messages to traverse hundreds of miles in a matter of days. Commanders on the battlefield constantly received up-to-date information. Coordination of action over vast distances remained effective. This is how the synchronized invasion of two countries was achieved. Thus, the left wing advancing into Poland in 1241 knew of the actions of the main army in Hungary and corresponded to the overall operational plan. This was not the result of luck or improvisation. This was a functioning military communication infrastructure that the armies that were defeated by them simply did not possess. When you examine the Mongol military system as a whole, the horses, the bows, the decimal structure, the meritocratic leadership, the preparatory intelligence, the communication, you cease to be surprised by their victories. Rather, you begin to be amazed that anyone ever managed to stop them at all. This brings us to the question of how exactly they fought, because understanding the system is one thing, and observing it in action is another. I want to begin this section with an important clarification. The Mongols are often depicted as outnumbering their opponents with overwhelming numbers and incredible ferocity. If you are interested in medieval warfare, you have likely encountered this image. The Mongol horde, a countless mass of horsemen, sweeping all before them purely by virtue of numbers. This image is mistaken. Mongol cavalry rarely outnumbered their opponents on the battlefield. Indeed, it often fought against noticeably larger armies. A standard tumen consisted of 10,000 horsemen. In large campaigns, 2 or 3 tumens of actual Mongol cavalry might participate, augmented by allied and conquered peoples. But the core Mongol strength, the cavalry that actually drove these conquests, was often the smaller army on the field. They won because they were smarter. Let's break down exactly how. The primary Mongol battlefield tactic was what military historians call the feigned retreat. It was so effective and consistently decisive that it is astonishing how it continued to work against new opponents who should have received intelligence about it from their predecessors. The answer to this puzzle reveals something important about human psychology in battle. But first, let's break down the tactic itself. The feigned retreat is simple in description and extraordinarily difficult in execution. A portion of Mongol forces, typically light cavalry, engages the enemy, draws them into a skirmish, then retreats and rides away, quickly, seemingly in disarray, creating the appearance of flight from the battlefield, and the enemy pursues them. This is where things get interesting. The pursuing side makes 3 critical mistakes simultaneously. First, their formation breaks down. They are chasing. They are advancing in order. Second, their fastest riders break forward, separating from the main army. Third, they are moving in a direction chosen for them by the Mongols, away from their original defensive positions. Meanwhile, heavy cavalry and additional light cavalry units that have been out of sight on the flanks begin to move. They do not reveal themselves until the pursuing forces are fully committed, and then the retreating Mongols execute a sudden turn. The mechanics of this turn were honed to perfection. A Mongol cavalry unit could stop on the move, turn, and reform at high speed because they had spent their lives in the saddle, because the horses instinctively sensed their riders, because the unit had practiced this specific maneuver hundreds of times during the hunt drives that served as training. This was not a chaotic mob turning in disarray. This was a precise military movement. The flanking cavalry closes in from both sides. The retreating forces, having executed their turn, move forward. The pursuing enemy, stretched out, disoriented, moving in the wrong direction on tired horses, suddenly finds itself surrounded, and arrows begin to fly. The vicious genius of this tactic was that it turned the enemy's aggression against itself. It demanded bravery from the enemy to advance. Aggressive pursuit was key, and that bravery was exploited for their destruction. The knights who attacked with the most zeal died first. It never ceases to amaze me that this continued to work. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, the Mongol commanders Subutai and Jebe employed essentially this tactic against a combined Rus and Cuman force, estimated at roughly 40,000 to 80,000 men. The Mongol forces were significantly smaller. The battle lasted about 9 days of maneuvering and concluded with the utter destruction of the Rus-Cuman army. Prince Mstislav the Bold of Galicia escaped with only a handful of men. Prince Mstislav II of Kiev surrendered, was captured, and according to some accounts, was executed by being smothered under planks so that his blood, considered noble, would not be spilled. This was a specific Mongol custom for respected but defeated enemies. Surviving Rus returned home to tell of their experience. And 14 years later, the Mongols returned with larger forces and repeated the same thing. The second key tactical system was encirclement, which the Mongols called the Tulughma, and it is a direct descendant of those hunting circles I spoke of earlier. A tumen would advance, with its flanks extending out on either side of the central portion. The flanks were mobile enough to swing far behind the rear of any conventional enemy formation. Light cavalry on the flanks would engage and distract the enemy, while the flanks continued to diverge and wrap inward from the rear. By the time most commanders realized what was happening, their army was partially or fully encircled, and the Mongols chose the distance at which they would fight, always slightly beyond the effective range of their enemy's weapons, but within the range of the Mongol composite bow. The Battle of Mohi in 1241 exemplifies the full Mongol operational system at its finest. King Bela IV of Hungary with some 60,000 men, which was a considerable force. He had encamped in a strong position on the Saho River. Subutai, commanding the entire campaign, sent a diversionary detachment under Batu Khan for a direct assault on the bridge over the Sajo. This was enough pressure to draw Bela's attention to this threat. Subutai then personally led a separate detachment across another crossing point, downstream, at night, entirely undetected, and appeared at dawn behind the Hungarian camp. What followed was not a battle. It was the systematic annihilation of an army that found itself in an impossible position. Bela's forces were encircled from many sides. When the Hungarians attempted to form up and break through, Mongol arrow fire shattered any attempt at organized resistance. Here is a detail that, in my opinion, best reveals Mongol thinking. They deliberately left one direction for escape open, not out of mercy but out of calculation. An encircled army that believes it will die if it stays will fight with extraordinary desperation. Men who believe themselves already dead become dangerous, but offer them a breach, a direction that looks like a path to salvation, and they will move towards it. They will cease to be an organized defensive force and become a fleeing mob. And a fleeing mob can be pursued and killed at leisure. The Mongols pursued the Hungarians for 2 days after the battle. The killing continued for many miles. Contemporary accounts record the plain being covered with bodies for a distance of 2 days' ride. Bela IV escaped. He spent the next several months hiding across Europe, from Croatia to the Adriatic coast, while Mongol detachments hunted him. According to one historian, he was the most hunted king in medieval European history. On the battlefield itself, the Mongols used their communication systems, drums, horns, signal flags, to coordinate complex movements of multiple units in real time. Units responded to these signals. They waited for messengers or personal orders. This gave Mongol commanders a speed of tactical adjustment that enemy commanders could simply not match. And by the time a European field commander had relayed a new order to his units, a Mongol formation had already changed twice. There were also smaller tactical details that accumulated over time. Mongol warriors deliberately targeted enemy horses. They even had a special arrow tip designed for killing horses. The falling of horses turned cavalry into slow infantry. They deliberately used smoke and dust to conceal their movements, to blind the enemy for flanking maneuvers, and to disguise the true number of riders on the battlefield. To create an illusion of numbers, felt effigies on spare horses were used, making a force of 10,000 men look like 20,000. The psychological aspect deserves separate attention. The Mongols understood something that remained beyond the comprehension of most armies of the time. Battle was won not on the day itself, but weeks and months before, in the minds of those who were about to meet them. They systematically and deliberately cultivated and maintained a reputation for absolute and merciless destruction of any force that offered resistance. If a city fell after resisting, its entire population could be utterly annihilated. Men, women, children, down to the animals in the streets. A few survivors were deliberately allowed to escape, so that they would carry this message to the next city along the way. That next city, receiving the survivors and hearing their story, faced a simple choice: fight and undoubtedly die, or surrender and possibly live. Many chose surrender, and many cities surrendered without a fight. This was not mindless brutality, but a carefully considered policy, executed with the same discipline as all other elements of the Mongol military system. Terror amplified the army's power, and the Mongols wielded it as a tool. The military genius in all of this, I want to emphasize, is that this tactic required an extraordinary combination of qualities rarely found in a single army. It required speed and patience simultaneously. It required individual warrior skill and collective discipline simultaneously. It required aggressive action and calculated selectivity simultaneously. The feigned retreat fails if the retreating cavalry panics and genuinely breaks and runs. Encirclement fails if the flanking cavalry attacks too early and warns the enemy. The psychological campaign fails if the army is not disciplined enough to avoid a massacre of those who surrender. The Mongols maintained all these balances through countless campaigns on multiple continents, under various commanders, against enemies with entirely different fighting styles, and in diverse natural environments. This is not a failure, it is a system. There is a version of the Mongol cavalry story that ends on the battlefield, on tactics, on overwhelming speed and ferocity. But this version misses something crucial. The Mongols did not fight only on open fields. The world they were conquering was full of walls. Walled cities were the bedrock of 13th century defensive architecture. All military logic of fortifications rested on a simple idea. If you can make an attacker stop, you neutralize his main advantage. A mounted army at a city wall cannot move faster than that wall is high. It cannot maneuver around stone. It cannot rain arrows down on defenders firing from crenellated ramparts without serious cost. The Mongol campaigns immediately encountered this problem. During their first campaigns against the Jin dynasty in northern China, beginning around 1211, Genghis Khan's forces encountered heavily fortified cities with sophisticated Chinese defensive technologies, multiple walls, moats, resilient gatehouses. The Mongol cavalry that annihilated Jin armies in the field could not take Jin cities by the same methods. Most conquerors, facing this problem, either failed or spent years besieging cities one by one. The Mongols did what was typical for them. They found people who knew how to solve this problem and made them part of their army. 4 Chinese siege engineers were incorporated into the Mongol forces, sometimes voluntarily, when cities surrendered, sometimes by force, when they did not. These engineers brought with them the technologies of their civilization: trebuchets, mangonels, and counterweight catapults. They brought knowledge of how to undermine walls with saps, how to dam rivers to flood fortifications, how to build siege towers and covered assault ramps. The Mongols proved to be remarkably quick learners. By the time of the Middle Eastern campaigns under Hulagu Khan in the 1250s, the Mongol army possessed a full s. These were not attached auxiliary units. They were integrated into the operational planning of the campaign. The siege of a city was coordinated so that cavalry blocked all supply routes. Engineering teams prepared assault positions, and psychological operations demanded surrender. All simultaneously. The siege of Baghdad in 1258 serves as the most vivid example of this system working in full. Baghdad was not just a city, it was the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the religious and political center of the Sunni Islamic world, for 5 centuries. Its caliph, al-Mustasim, was one of the most influential symbolic figures of the medieval era, and he made a fatal miscalculation. He believed Baghdad was protected by its reputation as reliably as by its walls. He was convinced that no conqueror would dare to risk the religious consequences of attacking the center of the Islamic world. To Hulagu Khan's demands for surrender, he sent an insulting reply. Hulagu invested the city with cavalry, cutting off all escape routes. Engineering teams took up assault positions, and a systematic artillery bombardment began. The siege lasted 13 days. When the walls were breached and the city fell in February 1258, the destruction was so immense that contemporaries, including Islamic historians who had no reason to exaggerate Mongol effectiveness, described it with a degree of disbelief. Libraries containing centuries of scholarly and literary works were burned. The canal and irrigation systems that had supported agriculture in the region for millennia were utterly destroyed. The caliph himself was killed. The Mongol justification for destruction was always framed as the consequence of choosing resistance, and this framing itself served as a siege weapon, aimed at the next city on the list. The contrast with cities that surrendered is stark and well documented. Samarkand, one of Central Asia's magnificent cities, offered brief resistance and was devastated in 1220. However, other cities along the Silk Road that submitted without a fight were preserved, incorporated into the Mongol trade network, and actually prospered under Mongol rule. There was no arbitrariness in this. The Mongols were building an empire, not merely raiding. They needed functioning cities for tax collection and trade. Violence was calculated to compel submission, which made peaceful annexation possible. This part of the Mongol story does not fit the popular image of savage nomads. It requires recognizing that their leadership thought systemically. Genghis Khan, his successors, and his generals did not simply follow their instincts. They were implementing a complex strategic program that used violence as leverage to achieve specific political and economic goals. The ability to take castles was the culmination of this program. Without it, Mongol cavalry could terrorize an empire, but it could not hold it. Cities would simply wait behind their walls, rebuild, and rise again. With integrated siege capabilities, the ability to take any city that refused to surrender, the Mongols closed off the last escape route. There was nowhere to hide. There was no defensive architecture that could guarantee survival. The only variable was, would you surrender before or after the army arrived? This realization, spreading across the medieval world, that even stone walls were no longer safe, was itself a strategic weapon created by the combined efforts of cavalry and siege engineers. I have dedicated a large part of this video to describing what Mongol cavalry was capable of, but there is another question that I find equally fascinating, and it is one that most fully reveals how this system actually worked, where it failed, because it did fail, and the location and circumstances of these failures are not random. They follow a particular pattern that precisely shows what conditions were required for the Mongol military system to function. The first and most significant defeat in Western expansion occurred at the Battle of Ain Jalut in September 1260, in what is now northern Israel, the southern fringe of the Galilee region. To understand why this battle is so important, it is necessary to grasp the context. By 1260, the Mongols under Hulagu Khan had just destroyed Baghdad, eradicated the assassin strongholds in Persia, and swept through Syria with virtually no significant resistance. Damascus had fallen. Aleppo had fallen. The Crusader states were sending envoys to discuss alliances. Everyone in the region was trying to find a way to survive in the face of what appeared to be an unstoppable westward advance. The only force that decided to fight, rather than negotiate, was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, and their sultan, Qutuz, made a decision that required a particular kind of courage. He moved north to meet the Mongols, rather than waiting for them to come to Egypt. The Mamluk army that met the Mongols at Ain Jalut was itself a cavalry force, and the Mamluks, military slaves of primarily Kipchak Turkic origin, were themselves superb horsemen and archers. They had watched the Mongols for decades. They understood their tactics. They had learned the lesson of every army that had encountered Mongol, feigned retreats, and perished because of it. At Ain Jalut, the Mamluk general Baybars used a feigned retreat against the Mongols. He lured the Mongol cavalry into broken terrain, a landscape of hills and narrow passes, where their numerical advantage in cavalry was reduced, and their encirclement tactics became much more difficult to execute. Then the main Mamluk forces, which had been held in reserve, attacked the flanks. The Mongol force at Ain Jalut, numbering between 10,000 and 20,000 men, was far smaller than those that had taken Baghdad. Much of Hulagu's army had already departed the region following the death of the great Khan Monka. They were defeated. Their commander, Kitbuka, was captured and executed. The Mongols would try to regain control of Syria several more times, but each attempt failed due to Mamluk resistance. The westward expansion of Mongol cavalry ended at this point. What does Ain Jalut actually signify? In my view, it demonstrates two crucial things. First, the Mongol military organization was not magically invincible. It could be overcome by an opponent who had equal quality cavalry. understood Mongol tactics well enough to use them against them, and chose terrain that limited Mongol maneuverability. Second, and perhaps more significant, the Mongols at Ain Jalut were operating with depleted forces in unfamiliar territory, far from their rear bases, during a period of political dissension. Their system was weakened, not broken at the peak of its power, but weakened systems lose battles, and that matters. The failures in Japan in 1274 and 1281 revealed a completely different vulnerability of the Mongol war machine. This system was built for the steppes, open plains that allowed for maneuver and the execution of encirclement tactics that required vast space. A sea invasion, by contrast, was an environment that entirely stripped cavalry of its advantages. The horses were on ships, the riders too. The composite bow, while still effective on land, had to be reached first, and the Japanese samurai who defended those beaches were themselves formidable warriors on terrain they knew intimately. The first invasion attempt in 1274 resulted in landings on Kyushu, where the Mongols encountered fierce Japanese resistance, after which they were forced to retreat. The second invasion in 1281 was launched with a significantly larger force, between 100,000 and 140,000 men, transported by a combined Mongol-Chinese-Korean fleet. Then, a typhoon struck. While contemporary Japanese chronicles describe a storm of unusual ferocity, modern geological studies have found physical evidence corroborating the impact of a powerful typhoon on the region. At that time, between 60% and 90% of the fleet was destroyed. The army never managed to land in full force. The Japanese called this typhoon kamikaze, the divine wind. This term would resonate in Japanese military culture for the next 7 centuries. Campaigns in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Burma, Java, demonstrated yet another significant limitation. In dense jungles and tropical climates, horses became a liability rather than an advantage. Animals died from heat and unfamiliar diseases. Tactics common on the steppe, dependent on visibility, space, and the ability to use high speeds, proved useless on terrain where visibility did not exceed 10 meters, and movement was measured in hours, not kilometers. Vietnamese forces under the Tran dynasty repelled Mongol invasions in 1258, 1285, and 1287–88. 3 separate attempts over 3 decades. Each time, the Vietnamese avoided pitched battles on open ground, attacked Mongol supply lines, used the terrain and climate to their advantage, and then struck when the Mongols were exhausted and dispersed. General Tran Hung Dao, who led the later defensive operations, perfectly understood the key principle. If you do not give cavalry the battle it needs, cavalry cannot win. You must deny them open ground, force them to slow down, let the heat and disease do what arrows could not. And finally, internal dissensions. After the death of Mungke in 1259, the succession crisis fractured the empire. The 4 major Ulysses that had previously comprised a single military system began to operate as independent states with their own interests. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate went to war with each other. The Chagatai Khanate fought against both. The strategic coordination that allowed for the simultaneous invasion of Poland and Hungary in 1241 became impossible when parts of the system were actively warring with each other. Mongol cavalry at the peak of its power represented not merely a singular unit of skilled warriors. It was an entire system, and systems require all their components to work together. When political cohesion broke down, so did the military system degrade. What remains astonishing, when you step back and look at the overall picture, is not where the system failed. What is astonishing is how far it got before it failed at all. The Mongol Empire is usually presented as a story of destruction, and that destruction was real. The numbers associated with it are staggering. Historians estimate that between 20 million and 60 million people died directly or indirectly as a result of the Mongol conquests during the 13th and 14th centuries. Prior to the Mongol conquest, Chinese territories, by some estimates, had a population of around 120 million. A census from 1300, after the conquest was complete, recorded approximately 60 million. Even accounting for the historical unreliability of these figures, and the fact that some population decline is attributable to administrative gaps in accounting rather than actual deaths, the scale of disruption was unprecedented for the medieval world. For example, the irrigation systems of Mesopotamia, infrastructure that had been built and maintained for millennia, providing for agriculture in one of Earth's most fertile regions, were destroyed during the conquest of Iraq and Iran. The human cost of these destructions was felt for generations after the armies had passed. These are all facts, and it would be disingenuous to downplay their significance in a video about the magnificence of the Mongol war machine. However, there is another side to this story, one that unfolded simultaneously with the destruction, and it too is true. The so-called Pax Mongolica, or Mongol peace, characterized a period of relative stability across the Eurasian continent that followed the main conquests, roughly from the mid-13th to the early 15th century. For the first time in history, a single political power controlled the entire Silk Road from China to the European frontier. Merchants could undertake journeys across this route that previously required traversing the domains of dozens of warring political entities, each imposing its own tariffs, presenting its own risks, its own probabilities of robbery or war. Now the route passed under a single legal system, with Mongol postal stations providing information and logistical support. Trade flourished. With trade came the movement of ideas. Chinese paper-making technology spread westward. Islamic mathematics and astronomy moved eastward. Agricultural methods crossed continents. Unfortunately, along these routes, the Black Death also spread. The connectivity that facilitated trade also allowed the plague to become a pandemic. However, the exchange of knowledge and technology led to real and long-term improvements in the lives of people far from the battlefields. William of Rubruck, a Franciscan friar who traveled to the court of the Mongols in 1253 on behalf of the French king, met Chinese artisans, European jewelers, a Persian engineer, a Nestorian Christian priest, and a Buddhist monk, all at the same court in the capital of the Mongol Empire in Central Asia. This single observation remarkably conveys something extraordinary about the world. The Mongol conquests had inadvertently created a unified Eurasian space where peoples and ideas moved with a freedom that would not be seen for many centuries. The Mamluk Sultanate, which stopped the Mongols at Ain Jalut, was itself built on principles of cavalry and organizational structures forged by decades of interaction with Mongol military art. The Ottoman army system, which dominated the Middle East and southeastern Europe for centuries thereafter, incorporated elements of Mongol decimal organization and meritocratic command culture. The development of the Russian army in the subsequent centuries was fundamentally shaped by the reality of existing under Mongol political authority. The influence of the Golden Horde on Russian military and administrative practices remains a subject of study and debate among historians to this day. In the 20th century, military historians analyzing the Blitzkrieg campaigns of World War II noted structural similarities with Mongol operational thinking, the emphasis on speed rather than mass, on the psychological disintegration of the enemy rather than the systematic destruction of his forces, on deep penetration bypassing strong points rather than their methodical breakthrough. The officers who developed these concepts studied Napoleonic and earlier military history, not Mongol history, but the underlying operational logic appears to be a rediscovery of principles developed by the Mongols 700 years prior, as these principles reflect something true about how to most effectively use mobile forces against an enemy relying on positional defense. There is also a strong argument by some historians that the Mongol conquests, despite all their destruction, accelerated the transfer of technologies that ultimately contributed to the European Renaissance and the dawn of the modern era. The spread of Chinese technologies, gunpowder, printing, advanced metallurgy into the Islamic world, and then into Europe, was faster and more complete because the Silk Road was briefly and violently unified under a single power. Gunpowder, which made European cannons possible in the 14th century, traveled via the Mongol Empire. None of this excuses the destruction. History does not work that way. One cannot atone for 40 million deaths with an improved trade route or technological exchange, but it does complicate a simple narrative. The most terrifying cavalry in history was also paradoxically one of the great engines of medieval globalization. The same organizational genius that enabled the success of the feigned retreat made the Pax Mongolica possible. The same ruthless pragmatism that burned Baghdad also preserved and prospered Samarkand. It is this duality, the realization that the system capable of the slaughter at Liegnitz could also enable William of Rubruck to meet a Chinese artisan in the Mongol capital. That is, in my opinion, the starting point for true historical understanding, not in praise or condemnation, but in an honest recognition that the most effective military force of the medieval world was also one of the most complex. Let's return to the beginning. April 9th, 1241. Henry II of Silesia watches the retreating Mongols and decides to pursue. Smoke, horns, the trap springs shut. Henry is defeated not by superior numbers. It was an army that had been forming for generations, not in barracks but on the steppe, in the saddle, on the hunt, in the daily practice of a culture that had optimized itself for horse warfare over centuries without consciously setting out to do so. Three factors, in my opinion, forged the most formidable cavalry in history. The first was the horse itself, not the majestic warhorse destrier, but the small, unremarkable, incredibly resilient creature that needed no grain, no roads, no supply lines, and could keep moving when any other cavalry in the world had to stop. This horse freed the Mongol army from the fundamental constraint that governed all other military forces of the era: logistics. The Mongols moved faster than their enemies could react because their horses physically made it possible. The second was the system of organization, the decimal structure, the meritocratic command culture, the communication network, the preparatory intelligence. They transformed exceptional warriors into a force capable of acting in concert over hundreds of miles and on multiple fronts simultaneously. Individual superiority loses battles due to disorganization. The Mongol system ensured the multiplication of individual superiority, not its waste. The third, and in my opinion, the most interesting, was the mindset, a willingness to learn, to master Chinese siege engineering, to study the tactics of their enemies and use them against them, to incorporate conquered peoples and their skills into the army, rather than simply annihilating everyone. Most empires in history have died from their own ossification, from the assumption that what worked before will continue to work, that their way is the only way, that adaptation is weakness. The Mongols, by contrast, treated adaptation as a weapon, and it was exactly that. What I find truly striking, looking back from 800 years away, is that the most formidable cavalry in history was not a product of wealth, industry, or any advantage in raw resources or population. The Mongols hailed from one of the harshest, most resource-scarce environments on Earth, without cities, without factories. They had a culture that trained every man from childhood, an organizational genius that knew how to turn that culture into a military system, and a flexibility that allowed them to learn from anyone they encountered. This combination in the 13th century proved sufficient to conquer almost the known world. And on that note, if you have made it this far, you clearly strive for accuracy and understanding not just of what happened, but why and how. That is precisely what our channel is for. If this video has given you food for thought, even if you thought you knew everything about the Mongols, hit that like button. It really helps more people discover similar content. And if you want more of these deep dives, subscribe. Every one of our videos always goes this deep. I'll see you in the next one. End of file text plain. Start of file text plain. April 9th, 1241. The Battle of Legnica, Poland. Duke Henry II of Silesia watches the Mongol cavalry in retreat, a mirage of victory. His 20,000 knights and soldiers, the cream of Polish and German knighthood, stand ready. They see the enemy turning, seemingly fleeing. Horses thunder away, kicking up dust. The enemy is in full disarray, and Henry makes a fatal decision. He orders the pursuit. His knights break formation, their heavy war horses charging forward. Armor clangs, banners fly. The war cries of 10,000 men, certain of imminent victory, fill the air. They chase the retreating Mongols across the open plain, faster and faster, stretching their lines thin. The Mongol cavalry, however, is not truly retreating. It's a ruse. Suddenly, thick, black smoke billows, engulfing the flanks of the pursuing Christian forces. Some historians believe the Mongols employed a smoke weapon, perhaps naphtha, to blind and disorient their enemies. From within the smoke, horns blare. The Mongol retreat halts. They turn. In a coordinated maneuver, the entire retreating army pivots. Hidden flanking cavalry, unseen until this moment, crashes into the flanks of Henry's army. His knights, stretched thin across the plain, are caught in a trap. The battle, which seemed to promise an easy victory, turns into a swift and brutal slaughter. It lasts less than an hour. Duke Henry II of Silesia falls on the field. His head is paraded on a spear before the walls of Legnica. Reports claim the Mongols cut off the right ear of every Christian soldier killed that day, collecting 9 full sacks of ears as trophies. What's truly astonishing is that this was not even the main Mongol army. These were auxiliary forces. Simultaneously, 200 miles away in Hungary, another Mongol army executed an almost identical trap against King Bela IV at the Battle of Mohi. This coordination across vast distances, before the advent of telegraphy or radio, speaks volumes about the Mongols' sophisticated military system. They weren't just horsemen. They were architects of war, so far ahead of their time that their enemies often couldn't comprehend what was happening to them. The question isn't if the Mongols were dangerous, that's self-evident. The enduring puzzle for historians is how they achieved such dominance. How did a nomadic people from the steppes, lacking cities, formal armies, or an industrial base, become the most effective cavalry force in human history? The answer lies not just in battle tactics, but in foundational elements, beginning with the horse. The Mongol horse, often dismissed by Europeans as small and pony-like, was the linchpin of their military machine. Matthew Paris, an English monk writing in the 1240s, found them perplexing, seemingly inadequate for the apocalyptic army they bore. This was a grave misjudgment. While not the fastest on a straight track like an Arabian courser, the Mongol horse was perfectly suited for the realities of steppe warfare. Months of relentless travel across diverse terrain, without fixed supply lines. These horses could cover 95 to 120 kilometers daily, day after day. They subsisted on grass, unearthed from under the snow in winter, surviving temperatures that would kill other breeds. They were, in essence, self-sufficient military assets. This freed the Mongols from the logistical constraints that hobbled every other army. Every medieval army was tethered by the need to feed its men and horses, to move its supply wagons, slowing campaigns and limiting operations. The Mongols, unbound, could move anywhere, anytime. This was a strategic revolution, not just a tactical advantage. Each Mongol warrior typically rode 3 to 5 horses, rotating them to ensure constant freshness. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine noted that a warrior would not remount a horse until it had rested for 3 or 4 days. This created a living relay system that never tired. This speed was a profound shock to contemporaries, allowing Mongol forces to strike one location, disappear, and reappear elsewhere, often behind enemy lines. Beyond transport, the Mongol horse was a mobile support system. During long campaigns, warriors could draw a liter of blood, drink it for sustenance, and then close the wound. The horse survived. The warrior survived. The campaign continued. This practice, documented by Marco Polo, meant the Mongol army carried its own provisions. Horses also provided milk for kumis, hides for leather, tendons for bowstrings, and meat in dire necessity. The horse was not just a mount. It was a complete logistical base. The relationship between horse and rider was deeply personal, fostering a bond where horses responded to whistles like dogs. This allowed riders' hands to be free, the horse acting as a willing partner. This partnership was forged through lifelong immersion. Mongol children rode from age 3 or 4, and by 10, had spent more time in the saddle than most European knights in their careers. The horse became an extension of the rider's body, freeing their hands for the bow, the Mongols' primary weapon. The Mongols treated hunting and warfare as one. Their great Nuru hunts, vast encirclements of game, were essentially military exercises, honing skills in coordination, discipline, and maintaining formation over long distances. They were practicing warfare while hunting, an integral part of their culture. Genghis Khan didn't invent Mongol cavalry. He organized and refined a system that had evolved over generations. The steppe itself was their academy, and the composite bow their diploma. A Mongol archer could shoot a ballistic arrow 400 meters, enough to rain down on a formation, and accurately hit targets at 150 to 175 meters. In comparison, the English longbow, highly effective but cumbersome, had a maximum effective range of about 200 meters, and shooting from horseback was impossible. The Mongol composite bow, a marvel of engineering, was shorter, compact, and powerful. Made from wood, animal horn, and sinew, it stored and released energy efficiently. Its construction was complex, requiring years of practice to master. The Mongols meticulously cared for their bows, protecting them from the elements. The horn on the inner limb resisted compression, while the sinew on the outer limb resisted tension, creating a bow that stored energy through dual physical processes. This allowed a shorter bow to match or exceed the power of longer wooden bows. The Mongols mastered this engineering through practical experience, not scientific theory. Mongol archers carried multiple bows, specialized for different ranges and shooting from horseback. They carried quivers of 60 arrows each. Arrowheads were specialized. Armor, piercing, broadheads for inflicting grievous wounds, whistling arrows for psychological effect, incendiary arrows, and signal arrows for battlefield coordination. A single Mongol warrior was an entire weapon system. A trained archer could fire 6 arrows per minute. A tumen of 10,000 warriors, with half actively shooting, could unleash 30,000 arrows per minute. No medieval army could withstand this barrage. The Mongols deliberately targeted enemy horses, recognizing that a dismounted knight was a costly infantryman. They used smoke and dust to conceal movements and disorient opponents, creating tactical advantages. They even used dummies on spare horses to inflate their numbers, making 10,000 appear as 20,000. Their psychological warfare was equally devastating. They understood that battles were often won before they began, in the minds of their opponents. Cities that resisted faced utter annihilation, with survivors deliberately allowed to spread tales of terror, compelling subsequent cities to surrender without a fight. This wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated policy. Terror was a tool, amplifying their military might. The true genius of the Mongol system lay in its integration. It demanded speed and patience, individual skill and collective discipline, aggression and calculated selectivity. The feigned retreat failed if the riders panicked. Encirclement failed if flanks attacked too early. Psychological campaigns failed if armies couldn't control their brutal impulses. The Mongols maintained these delicate balances across continents, against diverse enemies, in varied terrains. Their ability to conquer fortified cities, a challenge for their cavalry-centric armies, was solved by incorporating siege engineers from conquered populations. Chinese engineers brought sophisticated siege technologies, trebuchets, mangonels, siege towers, and knowledge of mining and flooding fortifications. The Mongols, quick learners, integrated these skills into their operations. By the 1250s, their army had a massive siege train and thousands of Chinese engineering teams. The Siege of Baghdad in 1258 exemplifies this integrated approach. Baghdad, the heart of the Islamic world, fell despite its symbolic and defensive strength. The caliph's defiant refusal to surrender led to a brutal siege. Hulagu Khan encircled the city. His engineers bombarded its walls, and after 13 days, Baghdad fell, its destruction immense, its libraries burned, its irrigation systems ruined. The caliph was executed. The Mongols, however, offered a stark contrast to cities that surrendered. Samarkand, after brief resistance, was devastated. Cities that yielded, like Bukhara, were preserved and integrated into the Mongol trade network, even prospering. This wasn't arbitrary violence. It was pragmatic empire building. They needed functioning cities for revenue and trade. Violence was a tool to compel submission, enabling peaceful annexation. This aspect of Mongol conquest challenges the image of mere nomadic raiders. It reveals a systematic strategic program where violence was a lever for specific political and economic goals. The capacity to take castles was the final piece, blocking any sanctuary behind walls. Without it, cavalry could terrorize, but not truly control. With integrated siege capabilities, the Mongols closed all avenues of escape. No defensive architecture could guarantee survival. The only choice was surrender before or after the army arrived. This realization itself was a strategic weapon. While the Mongol cavalry's battlefield prowess is legendary, their failures offer equally valuable insights into their system. The Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, in modern-day Israel, marked a significant turning point in the West. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, under Sultan Qutuz and General Baybars, met the Mongols. The Mamluks, also skilled cavalrymen, understood Mongol tactics. Baybars employed a feigned retreat, luring the Mongol forces into broken terrain where their cavalry advantage was diminished. The Mamluk reserves then attacked the flanks. The Mongol force, smaller than usual due to troop movements after Mongke's death, was defeated. Kitbuka, their commander, was captured and executed. This loss halted Mongol expansion into the Levant. Ain Jalut showed that the Mongol system wasn't invincible. An opponent with comparable cavalry, a deep understanding of Mongol tactics, and suitable terrain could win. Crucially, the Mongols at Ain Jalut were operating with weakened forces in unfamiliar territory, far from their supply bases, during a period of political instability. The failed invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 exposed another vulnerability. The Mongol system was built for the steppes, not for naval invasions. The sea negated their cavalry advantage, and Japanese samurai offered fierce resistance on familiar ground. The second invasion, a massive force of 100,000 to 140,000 men, was largely destroyed by a typhoon, which the Japanese called the kamikaze, or divine wind. Campaigns in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Burma, Java revealed further limitations. In dense jungles and tropical climates, horses became a liability. The Mongol tactics, reliant on open spaces and speed, were ineffective in terrain with limited visibility and arduous travel. Vietnamese forces repeatedly repelled invasions by attacking supply lines and using the terrain and climate to their advantage, striking when the Mongols were exhausted. General Tran Hung Dao understood that denying the cavalry its preferred battlefield was key to victory. Internal divisions after Mongke's death fractured the empire. The four great Ulysses, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty, began to act independently, even warring with each other. The strategic coordination that enabled simultaneous invasions in 1241 became impossible. The Mongol system, dependent on unified action, degraded as political cohesion dissolved. What's remarkable is not just where the system failed, but how far it succeeded before collapsing. The Mongol Empire is often seen solely through the lens of destruction. The estimated death toll, 20 to 60 million, is staggering. Infrastructure like Mesopotamia's irrigation systems was destroyed, with consequences felt for generations. However, alongside this destruction, the Pax Mongolica emerged a period of relative stability across Eurasia from the mid-1330s to the early 15th century. For the first time, the entire Silk Road was under a single political authority. Trade flourished, facilitating the movement of goods and ideas. Chinese papermaking spread west, Islamic mathematics and astronomy moved east, and agricultural methods crossed continents. Tragically, the Black Death also spread along these routes. This interconnectedness, while fostering trade, also enabled the plague to become a pandemic. Yet, the exchange of knowledge led to significant improvements. Friar William of Rubruck encountered a diverse array of peoples at the Mongol court: Chinese artisans, European jewelers, Persian engineers, Nestorian priests, Buddhist monks, all at the same table. This highlights the unintended creation of a unified Eurasian space, where people and ideas moved with unprecedented freedom. The military legacy is profound. The Mamluks, who stopped the Mongols, adopted cavalry and organizational structures influenced by their encounters. The Ottoman military system incorporated Mongol decimal organization and meritocratic command. Russian military and administrative practices were deeply shaped by the Golden Horde's influence. Even 20th century blitzkrieg tactics in World War II showed structural similarities to Mongol operational thinking, emphasis on speed, psychological shock, and deep penetration. Some historians argue that the Mongol conquests, despite their devastation, accelerated technological transfer, contributing to the European Renaissance. Gunpowder, crucial for 14th century cannons, traveled through the Mongol Empire. This doesn't excuse the destruction, but it complicates the narrative. The most fearsome cavalry in history was also a driver of medieval globalization. The same organizational genius that enabled tactical victories facilitated the Pax Mongolica. The same ruthless pragmatism that burned Baghdad also preserved Samarkand. This duality, the realization that the force that wrought destruction could also foster cultural exchange, is key to true historical understanding. Returning to Legnica, 1241. Henry II, confident of victory, pursues the retreating Mongols, only to be caught in a devastating trap. He was defeated not by superior numbers, but by an army forged over generations, not in barracks, but in the crucible of the steppe. Three factors shaped the formidable Mongol cavalry: the horse, not the majestic war horse, but a small, resilient creature that required no grain, roads, or supply lines, enabling unmatched mobility and freedom from logistical constraints. Organizational system. The decimal structure, meritocratic leadership, communication networks, and intelligence gathering transformed skilled warriors into a coordinated force capable of acting across vast distances and multiple fronts. This prevented the waste of individual superiority through disorganization. Mindset. A willingness to learn and adapt. They mastered Chinese siege engineering, studied enemy tactics, and integrated conquered peoples and their skills. Unlike empires that perished from rigidity, the Mongols embraced adaptation as a weapon. The most formidable cavalry in history emerged, not from wealth or resources, but from a harsh environment, a culture of lifelong training, organizational genius, and a relentless drive to learn and adapt. This combination in the 13th century nearly conquered the known world. If you've read this far, you appreciate depth and understanding. Hit like if this video offered new insights, and subscribe for more deep dives.